And now on to the final movement of the day. This is our last panel before we transition to the museum for some interactive session, time to be in the galleries, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that's going to work at the end. So this last panel, we've kind of gone from the institutional level, thinking about frameworks, thinking about collections and care, and now we're thinking about particular art objects in gallery and museum spaces. And so our final three panelists, I will introduce to you now. Ronald R. Bernier is Professor of Humanities at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. Joanna Homringhausen writes and teaches on sacred texts and their visual and material dimensions from antiquity to the present. Rebecca Taylor is an educator, researcher, and strategist working at the intersection of the arts, education, and philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Ron.
I was also, before I get started, I was also gratified to hear Emily speak this morning in her opening remarks about ASCHA, the Association of Scholars of Christianity in the History of Art, a mouthful, which I represent here today. Emily mentioned that it was at our symposium last year on pilgrimage, where she began to percolate the idea for this event. So it's great to hear that. And for those of you who don't know about ASCHA, please go online and look. If you believe that you've found your people here today, ASCHA is another one of those places where you can find them. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. In the quiet, elliptical rooms of the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, Claude Monet's water lilies unfold not as discrete paintings, but as an immersive environment of light, color, and reflection. Installed in 1927, shortly after Monet's death, the panels were offered to the French state as a monument to peace following the First World War. And in my larger study, of which this is a small part, I'm looking at what that exactly means, how these works can be thought of as a monument, and what exactly peace meant in this case. Yet, what we encounter here at the Orangerie is not simply commemoration, it's a radical transformation of painting, and I will argue, an attempt to turn painting into environment and to reconfigure the conditions of perception itself. First, I just want to give you a sense of where we're talking about. I'm talking about the Water Garden, which was a later addition to the property at Giverny, some 10 years after the completion of the Clos Normand, or the flower garden closer to the house. You see in the top diagram, the house at the top, then the Clos Normand, and then across the road, the Water Garden. And you can see in the earlier garden is characterized by geometry, linearity, rectilinearity, versus a garden that's more about immersion and abundance. Just to give you a quick peek, this is the Clos Normand, the more traditional flower garden near the house, and then the Water Garden. The two gardens function as complementary aesthetic systems. The Clos Normand is terrestrial, axial, geometric, chromatic, and perspectival. The Water Garden is aquatic, immersive, reflective, and anti-perspectival. This paper proposes that the Orangerie functions as a site of spiritual encounter within the ostensibly secular space of the modern museum. In drawing on phenomenology and theological aesthetics, I suggest that the experience structured by Monet's panels unfolds not only spatially, but temporally, as a durational event that resists immediate comprehension. Here, Henri Bergson's concept of durée will be essential for understanding how our perception accumulates, thickens, and unfolds through time, even as Maurice Merleau-Ponty's account of embodied vision situates the viewer within a shared field of vision. Together, these frameworks illuminate the way Monet's installation transforms seeing into a process of sustained, embodied attentiveness. And then finally, the last step in this argument, this durational and phenomenological structure, I will argue, prepares the ground for what theologian Jean-Luc Marion has described as a saturated phenomenon, an excess of givenness that overwhelms the subject's capacity to grasp it. In the luminous spaces of the Orangerie, perception itself becomes saturated, extended in time, embodied in movement, and opened onto a mode of encounter that approaches the structure of contemplation. First, just to give you a quick sense of, just to locate us, I'm showing you, we're going to start with the first room that you see, the larger of the two rooms in the diagram on the right. Now we'll leave it there. The first thing to note is the dissolution of the framed image. And art history has long emphasized Monet's formal innovations. For instance, the dissolution of the horizon line, the destabilization of perspective, and the movement toward abstraction grounded in perception. But what matters here is not simply what we see, it is how seeing itself is transformed. The Orangerie replaces the framed image with an immersive continuum. The viewer no longer stands before a painting, but is surrounded by it, drawn into a perceptual field that unfolds over time. Here, painting becomes environment. Again, the panels wrap continuously around the oval walls. There's no privileged vantage point, no single composition to master. Instead, perception unfolds through movement, walking, turning, pausing. What I'm showing you on the left-hand side is where our back is to this lower image in looking at the rest of the room. So this shift from room 1 to room 2 marks a transition from the more representational paintings, which I'm not showing you today, the more representational paintings of the Clos Normand, or the flower garden, which have a more mimetic relationship to the garden, a shift from that kind of representation to immersion, and a transformation of perception into attentive encounter. But to understand this environment, we need to look at Giverny, at the gardens. Monet's garden was not simply a subject, it was a constructed perceptual field itself. Water, vegetation, and reflection were orchestrated to destabilize spatial boundaries. The Orangerie translates this living environment into painted form. So what had been ecological becomes phenomenological. And again, these panels, let me go back to room 1. Water merges with sky, depth becomes indeterminate, orientation dissolves. We're no longer looking at a landscape. We are within a field of appearing. And here, Merleau-Ponty becomes essential. For Merleau-Ponty, perception is not detached observation, but embodied intertwining of seer and seen, what Merleau-Ponty calls the flesh of the world. Vision does not master the visible, it emerges from within it. And Monet's paintings visualize this condition. The visible is unstable, the subject is decentered, perception unfolds as event. At the Orangerie, the viewer's body becomes part of the perceptual field. So let's turn more specifically to the visual and spatial sequences across the two rooms. I'm showing you again the first room. The Orangerie consists of two elliptical rooms, as you saw in the diagram, each containing a continuous cycle of panels. Together, they form not a linear narrative, but a rhythmic, cyclical experience. Just again to situate you, and then again back in room 1. In room 1, we encounter a relatively open perceptual field, a field of indeterminacy, perceptual indeterminacy. Lighter tonalities predominate, blues, greens, pale violets. The tonal lightness produces an atmospheric diffusion. There are broad horizontal sweeps of paint, Reflections of clouds begin to dissolve spatial orientation. The water's surface acts as a threshold, neither fully surface nor depth. Crucially, no panel resolves into compositional closure. Instead, each functions as a fragment within a continuum. The eye searches for orientation but finds none. As one moves along the curved wall, no single panel asserts dominance. Instead, perception drifts laterally along the wall. The key here is the temporal unfolding. Again, no single panel will resolve the experience. Instead, vision is deferred, meaning accumulates slowly. The viewer becomes aware of duration. This is perception as process, not possession. And I want to draw your attention as we move into the second room to the doorways that move us into the second room as a place of transitional awareness. That passage from room 1 to room 2 is not merely architectural, it's experiential. It functions as a phenomenological threshold. It intensifies our awareness. We become conscious of our own movement, our own seeing. We become conscious of our own proprioception, that is, the body's capacity to perceive its own position and movement within a physical space. So again, we become conscious of movement, transition, and as we move from room 1 to room 2, reorientation or reset in our perception. And this moment is crucial. It introduces a structure analogous to ritual passage and perhaps transformation. So now we're in room 2. In room 2, the experience intensifies. Chromatic saturation increases dramatically, more intense violets, greens, and blues. There's a much denser orchestration of thicker brushwork, becoming more tactile. There's a greater dissolution of spatial reference. Here, the viewer ceases searching for orientation. Perception shifts from searching to reception. One begins to yield. The panels no longer invite interpretation, they impose presence. Across both rooms, the sequence moves from diffusion to saturation, from perceptual searching to perceptual surrender. The viewer no longer attempts to organize the image, but instead experiences it as overabundance. At this point, it's helpful to introduce the second philosophical framework, Henri Bergson's concept of durée, or duration. For Bergson, time is not divisible into a sequence of discrete, measurable units. It's not something we can divide into moments like points on a line. Rather, duration is lived time, or durée, continuous, qualitative, and indivisible. The layered brushwork, shifting tonalities, and dissolution of stable spatial coordinates do not present a single moment, but rather condense multiple moments of perception into a temporally thick surface. In duration, past and present interpenetrate, a continuous qualitative flow. Experience unfolds as flow, not as a series of static instants. So Monet's water lilies can be understood as paintings of duration rather than of space. The surface registers, as I've said, accumulated perception, brushstrokes, layer temporal experience. Light appears not as fixed illumination, but as continuous modulation. Again, we never see a single moment, we encounter a temporal thickness, a condensation of seeing over time. At the Orangerie, this Bergsonian structure becomes experiential. As we move along the curved walls, each panel is retained in memory. Each new view modifies what came before. Perception becomes cumulative and recursive. We do not simply see, we remember while seeing. So Bergson and Merleau-Ponty converge here. Bergson gives us the idea of time as flow, and Merleau-Ponty gives us perception as embodied participation. And together, they describe an experience in which the viewer is immersed in a temporal field, Perception unfolds through movement and memory, and the visible is never complete, but always becoming. At the Orangerie, we inhabit not a stable image, as I've said, but a durational event of perception. As the viewer moves through the elliptical rooms, each visual encounter is retained and modified by those that follow, producing that cumulative, recursive perception structured by memory as much as by immediate sensation. And this durational unfolding prepares the ground for what comes next. Because if perception is temporal, cumulative, and embodied, then it is also fundamentally limited. We cannot grasp the whole. In many theological traditions, the experience of the sacred is defined by excess, givenness, and ungraspability, or what Jean-Luc Marion describes as the saturated phenomenon. For Marion, certain phenomena exceed the structures through which we attempt to grasp them. They overwhelm intention with an excess of intuition, an overabundance of givenness. We've seen that the water lilies operate in precisely this register. The scale exceeds any single viewpoint. They resist synthesis. Their visual richness resists conceptual closure. Their spatial continuity prevents totalization. They overwhelm perception. The Orangerie stages precisely such a structure. The oval rooms recall chapel-like enclosures. The diffused natural light produces a sense of luminous suspension, and the circular movement of viewers echoes ritual or pilgrimage. I'm just reminding you here of similar types of experiences in the James Turrell and the Rothko Chapel. In other words, our perceptual encounter is deeply theological here. In many traditions, as I've said, the sacred appears as excess, as presence without mastery, as gift rather than object, or perhaps as the really real, as we've just heard. And here we might invoke Henri Nouwen. Contemplation is a disciplined attentiveness that opens the self to presence. And the Orangerie cultivates this, through silence, repetition, slow looking, and receptivity. Here, let's advance these slides. Here we do well to recall Monet's garden at Giverny. The garden was not simply a subject, as I said at the beginning, it was a constructed perceptual environment. Carefully designed plantings, manipulated water surface, constantly shifting reflections. The garden functions as an installation. The garden itself functions as an installation or proto-installation, a lived space of immersion. Together, garden and museum create what we might call a double liturgy. One enacted through movement in nature, one enacted through contemplative immersion in painting. Both cultivate a practice of attentive seeing. So seen through these lenses, Monet's water lilies emerge as more than a culmination of Impressionism. They constitute a profound experiment in embodied perception, phenomenological excess, and theological encounter. In the Orangerie, the paintings become environment, perception becomes contemplation, and the museum becomes, however briefly, a sanctuary of encounter. Thank you.
Today, I will be speaking about a work of art that I've sort of more or less stumbled on. I write on contemporary calligraphy, lettering art, and sacred text. I never envisioned this. I have a PhD in biblical studies, and there was this thing called the St. John's Bible, and it just sort of lured me in this rabbit hole, and now I just keep falling down it. And actually, I thought I'd gotten away from it, and now I'm writing about artists who worked on the St. John's Bible. So, This is a collaborative work that they did over the course of several years, and I've spoken about this in other venues and other aspects of it. There's a lot of elements and ways to look at it, but I will be focusing on the exhibition, the installation of it itself, and how that became its own kind of sacred space. So, in 2012, British lettering artists Susan Houghton and Hazel Dolby made a spiritual and artistic pilgrimage to Rome to sketch the ancient Latin letters found around the city. They began by copying inscriptions, not the massive monuments to famed emperors, but memorial stones marking the burials and names of early Romans, Christian, pagan, Jew. We don't always know from someone's name what religion they were. And for several years after, they revisited the city through their sketchbooks to create their own visual meditations. And there's way more than I can talk about today in the work. They did memorial books, textile art, woven panels, as well as some of the things we'll be looking at today. So this work culminated in Remembrance of People Past, which was at the University of Sunderland in 2019, not because there was some gallery of art and religion, but because the University of Sunderland has a major calligraphy research center, so they were sort of part of that thematic site. So the work itself is a process that they collaborated on. And today we'll be looking at them as works of pilgrim art and as a recreation of a pilgrimage and a sacred space. So we'll start with their own work, kind of as pilgrims, what did they do, and then turn to pilgrim art as sanctity, story, and Christian memory. And if any of you are thinking, I've studied, you should read Kate Baruch's work on pilgrimage and contemporary art. I studied with her, so we all have our influences that find their way in. And this has led me in many different directions. So they went to Rome, and if you go to Rome, there's a whole kind of traditional pilgrim setup. We have guidebooks that tell you where to go to see the tombs of famous popes, of early martyrs, and of early apostles, the Seven Churches pilgrimage, and this is one kind of form of pilgrimage in Rome. And Houghton and Dolby were also doing another kind of Roman pilgrimage. If any of you have ever studied the history of lettering or maybe typography, you will probably have seen the Trajan column inscription. This is almost held as the gold standard for a certain kind of very formal, capital style Roman letter that screams power and might and empire, and it has a whole kind of connotation to it. And they're very beautiful and they're very intricate, and people have written entire treatises on the geometry of these. And so, for example, on the right, this book by John Stevens, Mastering Brush Roman Capitals. So this is actually, you take a flat brush and you have some kind of size on it to make it stiff, and then you use that as your nib, so to speak, because this is way too large to use a metal pen nib or a quill. And so that's how you get those. They're very subtle. In calligraphy, the hardest stuff is the stuff that's sort of unadorned. You can't hide behind cute squiggles and things. If you don't know the form, you don't know the form. So this is harder than it looks. And of course, we have typefaces inspired by this. The Jenny Holzer work that's on the outside of the Racklin Roman capitals. They're everywhere. But they were interested in these things, the minor inscriptions, the less formal lettering, the names of what one archaeologist has described, the silent yet not anonymous 100,000 names of people who lived, died, and were buried in the city of Rome. And they're not anonymous because we have their names, but they're silent because we have nothing else about them. And so as Houghton and Dolby were wandering around Rome on their lettering tour, and they spent 10 days taking photos and sketching everything they could, and they did not go back since. They have not been able to. So all the works that they have made were based on that initial, I'm going to call it a pilgrimage still. These were the kind of things that they sought out. Many of them found at the Lapidary Gallery in the Vatican Museum. Some of these were used as spolia, put into other things. We're immediately getting the interconnection, the confusing messiness of sacred versus secular. If you go to the Vatican Museum website and say, what is it for? Art is evangelization. So there's a very clear mission statement that the Vatican Museum has in how they're putting these on display and showing them, even if we don't really know if all of these inscriptions were from early Christians whose piety is reflected in the stone. We just don't know. They're anonymous. So they start by making sketchbooks, as on the left. And then in the middle, this is a photo of one of the inscriptions that they saw, and each of them made a copy. One of them in textile art, that's at the bottom. Sue Houghton does a lot of textile art and calligraphy, and at the top, Hazel Dolby reproduces this on canvas. Copying, a normal practice for an art student, as well as for an art master who is seeking to learn a new style. And from here, from these kind of rigid copies, they start moving outward in creativity and going in different directions. And when I asked Sue, have you stopped this project? And she said, I don't know. They've done things that are not part of remembrance, but everything seems to be informed by it. So it has a way of cascading outwards. So I want to look at this as pilgrim art, because part of what pilgrim art does, if a pilgrimage is a physical journey to the holy, then pilgrim art are objects that facilitate the holiness and convey it in various ways. First, it can, as on the left, people can go to a sacred site and leave a trace of their presence there. And the handwriting is very important here. This is not fine calligraphy. This is just someone scratching their name in stone, a small prayer. Paul and Peter, pray for Victor. Peter and Paul, help Primus, a sinner. Also, pilgrim art can be somebody taking a bit of the holiness or the sanctity of a site and taking it home with them. So at right, we have one of many, many, many examples of early Christian pilgrim flasks. They'd be filled with a little bit of holy water, and you'd buy them at the site. Right, you could still do this today. You can go to like Lourdes and bring some holy water home with you. I've seen ones where they have like a rosary where there's a bit of holy water in one of the beads. So this is still going on. So on the left, we have these names, and on the right, this is one of the first things that they started doing. They started making these little kind of canvas, I'm not sure what else to call them, bricks perhaps, that just have names of early Romans that they saw. Again, we don't necessarily know the religion. I chose this particular image because we have the name Victor appearing twice. Houghton describes handwriting exposes the inner person, even when that is not the intention. Handwriting leaves a presence of the self. So if you go to the Racklin, go to the little chapel, I was just noticing this last night, so it was too late to put it in the PowerPoint. In the chapel, there's this beautiful glass behind the altar, and there's the aesthetic of handwritten letters. You really feel the artist's presence, their body, in the place. And then Jenny Holzer's on the outside, the words, the way they fit into the space, all very interesting, but the letters themselves are kind of typographic, cold, a little impersonal. There's no human trace, and I mean trace in the literal sense of there's no kind of marker of a human body that I could detect in looking at it. So the transfer of holiness, the practice of leaving your name or of transferring someone else's name as a way of transferring a part of themselves, because so much of who we are is bound up in our names. And here's a quote that Houghton said: "The fragments of the stones inspired us to engage with these people who actually lived and died. They were individuals. They were members of families and communities who cared enough to carve their names in stone." And here on the left are some more of the woven panels, the textiles that Houghton has been making. She's been doing these for years. It's much slower even than regular calligraphy. And these are quite small. So this is what you might call sort of pilgrim theology, but it's not the official church. It's the ordinary people and their ordinary stories about which we know so little because they're lost to history. starting to add symbolism, and again, in the chapel at the Racklin, all these beautiful little olive branches, a symbol of peace. So here is Houghton adding them into her own embroidery. And they really wanted to capture names of women, names of children, names of people who may have been enslaved. Some of these names, like Irene or Irina, comes from the word for peace. We have Fulvia, sweet soul. So we have little epitaphs, almost as if they're continuing the care for these people that their initial families did when they buried them. The letters are human, they're personal, they're kind of intimate. And yet they are also the bonds that create society. I'm feeling so much resonance with the last panel about how do we treat the dead? How do we conceptualize the dead and their memory? So when they started putting together the exhibit, they start replicating in more intriguing ways. These are little catacombs, little boxes. They're not very large, and they write names on the boxes, put them in these shelves, and they call these little catacombs. Now, we have other replications of catacombs. I think there's one in Denmark. So this is not a new thing, but they're doing this on a much smaller scale. On the right, just one example of the many replications of sacred space in the history of art. On the right, this is the replica of St. Francis, the shrine of St. Francis in San Francisco. So this is not actually in Italy, it's just sort of cosplaying it. So they're doing this in an art gallery. Here's a wall a memorial wall. This is Hazel Dolby's work, a giant wall of things that look like really old building stones and putting dried flowers on them, as Romans did, as we do, putting flowers at graves, and just putting little bouquets of names, of memories, of bits of kindness and memory of the dead. This is their own, I'll call it, pilgrim narrative, in much the same way that something like Marjorie Kemp has a pilgrim narrative, or Aguirre has a pilgrim narrative. This is their pilgrim narrative in art form that then we get to go to the gallery and re-experience. So here in their own work, they're recreating the sacred space. They're putting it into a secular university art gallery. I did ask, how did people interact with the space? And Susan said, it seemed less religious than you would think. It was a little, people seemed to treat it more as an artwork, as the letter forms, the aesthetics of them. And yet, I'm a little skeptical, because I think if I had been there, it would have felt like a very religious moment. And I love the way that they have deliberately confused. They're not really going for, this is memories of early Christians, even though these were both scribes who worked on the St. John's Bible, even though Susan Houghton is married to a Methodist minister. They very much said this is just ordinary Romans, and there's something beautiful about, we don't know what their religion was, it's just they were. So I would love to hear any questions or comments. I'm writing about this for a forthcoming volume that ASCHA is putting out, and I have some other things about graffiti and sacred space and lettering that I've been doing recently. So thank you all for being here today.
I'll wait for tech, but while I do, I'll just quickly introduce myself. Hi, my name is Rebecca Taylor. I had a 20-year career in the art world, working at various museums, first MoCA, then the Getty, then MoMA, and then as a strategist and consultant for museums and galleries all over the world, before returning to academia a few years ago to research a lived contemplative practice that I have, that I then turned into a contemplative pedagogical framework. And today I'm going to tell you the story of when that contemplative pedagogy re-entered my personal life in a spiritual way. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So my paper's titled Representing a Contemplative Aesthetic Practice for Spiritual Encounter. Please be forewarned, this was originally 8,000 words that I'm now reducing to 15 minutes, so forgive me if any part of it feels a little abrupt or abbreviated, but that's the reason. So, a deep spiritual life makes us so alert and aware of the world around us that all that is and happens becomes part of our contemplation and meditation. Henry Nouwen's words point towards a capacity that our hyper-connected age has made both more difficult and more urgent. The capacity for sustained contemplative attention to the world around us and to the divine presence. Philosopher Maxine Greene has argued that works of art possess a unique capacity for engendering what she called wide awakeness, a state of heightened consciousness, engaged presence, and self-reflectiveness. I believe encounters with works of art can become ritualized pathways to spiritual awakening, connection with the divine, and ongoing transformation. Drawing from personal experience, the tradition of contemplative practices, and the theological tradition of Visio Divina, Latin, divine seeing, I offer represencing as a contemplative aesthetic practice for spiritual encounter, one that awakens us to ourselves, to the world, and to the divine through repeated, sustained engagement with works of art. Represencing calls for triadic presence, being present with, close looking, present to, deep feeling and embodied engagement, and present for, sincere reflection and transcendence with works of art. The practice treats artworks not as objects of aesthetic appreciation alone, but as companions, what John O'Donohue might call anam cara, or soul friends, those to whom we might disclose our deepest inner life. In our hyper-networked world, where the continuous cacophony of smartphone notifications and endless scrolling often leads to what Franco Berardi calls attentive stress, this practice offers a counterformation, intentional disconnection from devices to enable fuller presence to experience, to ourselves and the divine. The museum becomes an active site of spiritual formation, where art mediates ongoing encounter with what remains fundamentally ungraspable, God. Through 3 vignettes, I will demonstrate how represencing functions as a contemporary form of Visio Divina, adapted for pilgrims who cannot live in monasteries, but can return regularly to museums. Vignette 1, Assisi, May 2024. In May 2024, I fulfilled a lifelong dream, and I made a pilgrimage to Assisi, Italy. While en route, I felt joyous anticipation and also a bit of trepidation. What if this place wasn't as magical as I hoped? What if my worldly worries overshadowed its spiritual dimensions and I wasn't able to connect with God? So I arrived, I dropped off my luggage at my Airbnb, and I made my way toward the chapel of San Giorgio to see the famous Giotto frescoes and to commune with the spirit of St. Francis. Sitting in silence in the tomb, all my fears were squashed. It was indeed, quote, a thin place where the, quote, the visible and the invisible worlds seemed to converge. It was where the veil between the material and spiritual seemed permeable, and I felt that connection I'd longed for. After about an hour or so, I walked upstairs and out into the sunshine to meander the winding streets of this beautiful little town, just as St. Francis had. Suddenly, church bells pierced the silence and stopped me in my tracks. I realized I had wandered off the main road and was now completely alone on a quiet street. I stood there in the shadow of the tower, and I felt my heart beat attuned to the rhythm of the bells. And Rilke's words came unbidden to mind. Quiet friend, who has come so far. Feel how your breathing makes more space around you. Let this darkness be a bell tower, and you the bell. As you ring, what batters you becomes your strength. Move back and forth into the change. In that moment, I experienced the quote, the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, and what William James would characterize as a genuine religious experience. Ineffable, noetic, transient, yet leaving an indelible mark. I wanted to bottle that feeling so that I could carry it with me back to the daily grind of my frenetic world in New York, but I knew that would be easier said than done. Nearly 1 year later, April 2025, I visited the newly reopened Frick collection in New York. I said hello to several of my old friends I had missed deeply, Vermeer, Turner, Rembrandt. But that day, it was a Giovanni Bellini that stopped me in my tracks, St. Francis in the Desert, circa 1475 to 1480. The moment I rounded the corner into the gallery, I was immediately transported back to my transformative days in Assisi. There was Francis in the rocky wilderness of Mount Subasio, emerging from one of its natural caves that I'd walked through, with arms outstretched in a gesture art historians variously interpret as receiving the stigmata or experiencing divine ecstasy. I'm an art historian, but I wasn't thinking about scholarly debates. I was re-experiencing the bells, the silence, the peace that passes understanding, the echo of Rilke's words. Having walked where Francis walked and felt a deep spiritual connection to that place, the painting became a, quote, epiphanic memorial in the Jamesian sense of a place or an object that represents a past spiritual encounter, and a threshold for reaccessing that deep religiosity of that experience. Every element participated in what felt like theophany: the gnarled olive tree, the distant shepherd, the luminous sky. To deepen the connection, I put in my AirPods and I listened to an audio recording of Rilke's Let This Darkness Be a Bell Tower. Importantly, the painting didn't simply remind me of Assisi. Rather, in the tradition of Visio Divina, it represented the encounter, making present and newly palpable, again, the spiritual connection and divine peace I'd experienced there. Bellini's Francis did not merely depict a scene of spiritual transformation, but was itself a conduit for such an encounter, allowing me to renew and revitalize that connection and inner peace I'd felt when I was in that very special place, and carry it forward. And then I had another epiphany, realizing I was unconsciously engaging my long-standing contemplative aesthetic practice, what I call represencing, a practice for meaning-making, connection, self-cultivation, and awakening. 7 months passed. The ordinary pressures of life accumulated: professional demands, relational strains, and the grinding anxiety of simply being human in a world that demands constant productivity. I'd been having a particularly difficult week, and I was disconnected from that peace that I'd found in Assisi. Purposefully, I returned to the Frick. Standing before Bellini's St. Francis once again, I put in my AirPods and I listened to Rilke's Let This Darkness Be a Bell Tower on repeat. As my eyes took in the familiar Franciscan scene, the words washed over me. What batters you becomes your strength. And I began to feel that peace come over me, slowly at first, and then more fully. My breath deepened, the knot in my chest began to loosen. But this was different from my April encounter. In April, the painting had surprised me with recognition. Now I was coming to it with intention, seeking it as one seeks a trusted friend in crisis. And it met me there. My eyes were drawn to Francis's hands, to the places traditionally associated with the stigmata, those wounds that mark participation in Christ's suffering. The stigmata became, for me, not merely marks of suffering, but signs of intimacy. Evidence that our wounds, when offered rather than hidden, can become the very places where we encounter the divine. I noticed Francis's gesture again, arms outstretched, but now I saw it differently. He wasn't just receiving the stigmata, but offering himself, wounds and all, to the light breaking through the clouds. The painting was teaching me something new, that transformation requires bringing our darkness into the presence of the divine, not hiding it away until we feel worthy. Then, seeking deeper consolation, I opened Rilke's Book of Hours on Audible, and in the spirit of holy serendipity, I let the app choose a poem at random and beckon divine guidance. What came felt like a direct word spoken into my precise condition. I love the dark hours of my being. My mind deepens into them. There I can find, as in old letters, the days of my life already lived and held like a legend and understood. Then the knowing comes. I can open to another life that's wide and timeless. That poem spoke perfectly to my state, the dark hours I was living through, the way my mind was deepening into them rather than fleeing, the sense that somehow these struggles were not obstacles but pathways to another life that's wide and timeless, in Rilke's words. Standing before Bellini's St. Francis with Rilke in my ears, I ceased, if only for a moment, to fear my darkness. The painting had become more than an epiphanic memorial. It had become an active threshold, a place where past grace met present need and opened toward future transformation. These 3 encounters revealed that my experience in Assisi did not have to remain an isolated epiphany. Bellini's painting became a threshold through which I could return to that grace, and each return deepened the relationship, showing me that artworks can become what the Celtic tradition calls Anamkara, soul friends, and that represencing could be a pathway to divine connection and spiritual transformation. As the vignettes I've just shared illustrate, represencing approaches art as a threshold to heighten consciousness, Green's awakeness, self-encounter, and transformation. The practice involves returning repeatedly to particular artworks, engaging them through extended observation, what art education traditionally calls slow looking, embodied presence, and the contemplative openness to their spiritual resonance. A triadic form of inquiry that spans past memory, present attention, and future possibility. Through this sustained relationship with an artwork across time, it gradually reveals itself to be more than an object or an image. It becomes an anamkara. This practice is rooted in the tradition of Visio Divina, a contemplative approach to visual images analogous to Lectio Divina, divine reading with sacred texts. Represencing extends this tradition in 3 crucial ways. First, it emphasizes repeated encounters with the same artwork over time, not single contemplative viewings. Second, it operates explicitly within Augustine's triadic temporality. Each encounter engages memory, attention, and expectation simultaneously. In his Confessions, Augustine proposed that all time exists only in the present of past things, memory, the present of present things, attention, and the present of future things, expectation. Represencing operates precisely within this threefold present. We're simultaneously present with the artwork in attention. We're present to the memories and experiences it evokes for us, and we're present for the possibilities it opens towards our becoming. And finally, it responds to our post-digital condition by offering sustained embodied presence as resistance to digital fragmentation. So, cultivating triadic presence. As I've said, represencing entails embodied immersion with a work of art through triadic presence. Being present with corresponds specifically to Augustine's present of present things, the practice of focused attention, because it requires that we stand physically before an artwork, allowing ourselves unhurried time for sustained visual attention and contemplative seeing. This close looking is what ancient Greeks called prosouche, the gathering of our scattered faculties into unified attractiveness. As philosopher Pierre Hadot explains, prosouche relocates man within his genuine being, that is, his relationship to God. It is thus equivalent to the continuous exercise of presence, both to God and to oneself. Being present, too, corresponds to Augustine's present of present things, the work of memory. This dimension means allowing whatever past experiences, feelings, and bodily sensations that arise to come fully into awareness. During both of my visits, my physical response preceded cognitive understanding. Before I could articulate why Francis's outstretched arms spoke to my condition. The Philokalia speaks of gnosis, spiritual knowledge that is inspired by God and so linked with contemplation and immediate spiritual perception. Being present, too, requires the awakening of our spiritual senses, engaging our capacity to taste, touch, smell, and hear. Being present corresponds with the present of future possibilities, expectation, hope, an orientation towards what is yet to come, the possibility of encounter with the transcendent, of transformation, of becoming. Importantly, this practice is ritualized, meaning it's intentionally and repeatedly engaged over time. This repeated return to the same artwork deepens the relationship, allowing all of these things to foster and to converge. I'm going to skip ahead because I see I'm running out of time. What I go on to argue in the next section of the paper is that museums are places where we can engage such a capacity. If we can't return to the monastery as many before us have, we can return to the museum. It is a sacred space where we can engage deeply with this kind of practice. So the practice offers hope for a post-digital moment, not by solving its problems, but by demonstrating an alternative way of being, attentive rather than distractive, receptive rather than acquisitive, transformed rather than merely informed. In returning to Bellini's St. Francis across years, I've discovered what contemplatives have always known, that the journey is circular. As T.S. Eliot reminds us, the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. This is the gift of represencing, to return us to ourselves, to beauty, to silence, to God, to possibility. But now with eyes opened, hearts enlarged, souls awakened to the mystery that was always there, waiting for our recognition. O'Donoghue offers the fitting final invitation. Leave all agendas behind you. Let the neglected presence of your soul come to meet and engage you again. It can be a lovely reacquaintance with your forgotten mystery. Thank you.
What perfect words as we enter into the session of the day. We will be engaging with art objects. So thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panelists. Wonderful, wonderful way to end this portion of the day. We have time for questions. Yeah.
Who translated that edition of Viola that you were quoting? Oh, it's Joanna Macy and Anita Burrows edition. Oh, yeah. The Book of Hours and, all the Rilke translations come from them.
Wonderful, thank you.
They're my favorite. Well, I'll just say I loved your paper. I didn't talk about it here, but I've written extensively about this practice in relation to both Bergson and Merleau-Ponty. So loved.
We have to talk.
Yes, we definitely have to talk. And Bergsonian durée is so essential to how I think about time. I used it recently in a paper where I was arguing for Kairos time instead of Chronos time. Yeah. And Bergson is just
That's the title of my book is Kairotic Time. We're just going to have a
Yeah,
conversation.
sorry. We're just going to chit chat. And also, I love the Orangerie. It's so magical.
Ayla?
Thank you all. It's great stuff. And I noticed that for all three of you, at least to me, there was some quality of either on the surface or maybe just beneath the surface, resistance, counterculture, longing for a more just world, longing for the peace which the world cannot give. The Monet Wild project, most of it during and around the First World War, and then a kind of a cry for peace as well as a peace offering, at least in some ways. And I was thinking about that in terms of the longing for contemplative rest that you so beautifully and by chance as well as by intention found in Frick. I was there in April 25 as well, and I spent an hour crying with that painting.
It's magical.
was so glad that people just nodded sagely And in the early centuries in Rome, it is such a dangerous place to express one's beliefs in some ways, to put a name in stone. And so I'm wondering about the longing for peace and the countercultural protest in a violent world.
I mean, I'll just speak
Small
for myself.
small question.
Yeah, well, it's very real for me. So this practice actually began for me organically as my way of grounding myself and orienting myself in a world where I was traveling 300,000 miles a year and spending, 300 nights of it in hotels. And artworks became places, friends for grounding myself in whatever city I was in. I would have an artwork I would return to that allowed me to sort of anchor myself between when I had last been there and where I was now. And then coming out of COVID, I really used that practice intentionally to reground myself and make big life decisions about what I wanted to do next, including like giving up making a lot of money to come back to academia, because I just felt the horrors of the world more acutely in that moment. Not that they weren't there before, but they just, COVID made them so palpable, and I think things have only gotten worse since then. And at the moment, how many wars are we in? And we used to talk about how there hadn't been a huge war for 50 years, which was not true, but that was what people like to say. And so I saw this as a salve in my own life and wanted to offer it to others, particularly to my students, who I see suffering under the weight of the world. And instead of offering them tools, we offer them blame. I mean, you read any articles out there, and they're all so quick to point the finger at this generation as being too distracted, unwilling to work hard, all of these things. And actually, they're just drowning under the weight of a world we've created for them, and yet we're giving them no tools to deal with it. So for me, it very much is an act of resistance. It's a quiet act of resistance, and while it also feels individual, it's collective in spirit. I mean, Dewey would say you cannot change the world until you change yourself, and you start from within. So yeah, it's absolutely a counter practice for me.
I'm not sure if they were, I wouldn't characterize, I mean, they're not in the room, it's hard to speak for, this is the problem with working on living artists. You feel very cautious speaking for them. I don't get the vibe that they were doing some kind of protest, but I think that the very act of taking these names and representing them and rewriting them, that there's a kind of care, I almost want to say maternal. And I think that it's, if you're thinking about what they're doing with early Christian memory, they're sort of doing another form of the same thing that like all the New Testament feminist scholars who were going through the Gospels and finding who were these women, or the women that are mentioned in Paul's letters that are doing ministry, and just kind of trying to take those little tiny bits that we have and sketch them and elaborate them and imagine them more. I think that kind of memory work helps us imagine a different world now, but it's not necessarily like making a protest sign, which other calligraphers have done. So yeah, thank you for that question. You've given me more questions to ask. I'm hopefully going in October. Sue has offered to take me to Lindisfarne Island, so I have to go.
I guess I would say in Monet's case, it was much more of a personal, private sense of peace. He spent 43 years working on that garden and the paintings that emerged from it, being very much part of the physicality of the whole growing process. So he wasn't just directing gardeners to plant pretty flowers. it was a very personal environment because he was an old man and he lost a lot. He lost 2 wives, he lost a son, he lost a daughter-in-law, he lost all of his Impressionist friends, either through old age and death and sickness or through the war. So he had a very sort of personal response to all of that loss. And part of that response was just also an insistence on joy, an insistence on just being surrounded by beauty. And he carefully, not only did he carefully orchestrate every detail of both gardens, but he carefully choreographed who came to the gardens, who was permitted to experience the gardens. So yeah, during the war and immediately after, he had very specific things to say about Germany, about the war in general, and about his attitude toward it. But this was, I think, far more of a personal response to a lot of loss.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we'll give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you very much.